Welcome to ACSM's presentation of Research Checklists, Improving Research Quality in Sports and Exercise Science. This webinar is being presented as a collaboration between ACSM's Evidence-Based Practice Committee and the Translational Journal of ACSM. I'll introduce our presenters in just a minute, but first we have a few housekeeping items. Our presenters will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Throughout the webinar, please type your questions into the question area on the GoToWebinar screen. We'll take as many questions as possible after the talks. If you have trouble hearing or seeing the presentation today, it's likely due to your internet connection. Go ahead and log off and log back into the webinar. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Hayley MacDonald, Peter Katzmarzyk, and John Bartholomew as our presenters. Hayley is an assistant professor in exercise science at the University of Alabama, and she's also a member of the Evidence-Based Practice Committee. Peter Katzmarzyk is professor and Marie Adana Corcoran Endowed Chair in Pediatric Obesity and Diabetes, as well as the Associate Executive Director for Population and Public Health Sciences at Pennington Biomedical Research Center. He is the chair of the Evidence-Based Practice Committee. Finally, John Bartholomew is the Kinesiology and Health Education Department chair at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the editor-in-chief for ACSM's Translational Journal. At this time, we're going to turn it over to our presenters, and we'll rejoin you later for the Q&A.
All right, thank you. Well, we're pleased to be here today to talk about research checklists and why they're important within the context of sports and exercise science. So just by way of introduction, research checklists are really just simple tools to help researchers adhere to reporting guidelines when they're submitting their papers. Now, the Equator Network, which we will talk about in a little bit, defines reporting guidelines as checklists or flow diagrams or structured texts, which really help us as authors in reporting our papers and reporting the results of our studies with different study designs. Now, the checklists themselves provide the items essentially that we need to be keeping in mind when we submit a paper for publication to inform the reader of the key elements of the study design, methods, and the results. Now, research checklists are becoming more and more important, and more journals are actually asking for you to use them before you submit your paper. Now, the checklists themselves really enhance and standardize research quality. They aid in ensuring reproducibility of your results by other investigators. And I've really come to learn recently that they really help ensure comparability across studies when we summarize the literature. For example, when we're conducting meta-analyses or systematic reviews, if we have a lot more comparability across studies, it really enhances the value of all of the evidence when we try to combine it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hayley.
Great, thank you, Peter. Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk to you a little bit more about some of these specific research checklists. Before we get going, I do want to make a disclaimer that by no means is this a comprehensive overview of all of the checklists that are available. What we'll go through today are some of the main checklists that you might run into, some of the most widely endorsed and widely used checklists. I'll talk a little bit more about the Equator Network that Peter mentioned and show you a place where you can identify a whole host of other checklists, including the ones we talk about today in sort of the central repository. But to get things started, we'll talk briefly about the consort. So Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials, probably one of the most well-recognized and broadly endorsed checklists for primary research. As Peter mentioned, there's a whole host of issues with primary level research, inadequate reporting, and transparency of what methods were actually used. And so the consort was developed initially to alleviate the problems that arose specifically in randomized controlled trials. So developed in 1996 by the Consort Group, a group of individuals steadfast on alleviating this issue. Like most things, it's undergone significant revisions. So once in 2001 and again in 2010, And 2010 is the most recent statement, the consort statement that we all adhere to and endorse. There are several extensions available, both official and unofficial. By linking through the consort's main webpage, you can identify those that are officially endorsed by the group. And then through Equator, that central repository, you can find some of the unofficial endorsements as well. As Peter mentioned, the Equator Network sort of identifies these checklists as, flow diagrams, checklists, papers. And so specifically for the consort statement, it's got a checklist of 25 items. It also includes a flow diagram. And most importantly, probably, is the explanation and elaboration document. So the checklist is 25 items. And remember, what we're looking at here is the quality of reporting and the transparency of reporting, not necessarily the quality of the study itself. So similar but very different constructs, and we'll make sure that we sort of hit on that a couple more times this presentation. The flow diagram is a really useful tool to use, especially for researchers, not only doing primary level research, but also doing research syntheses. And it gives your readers and the editors and people trying to understand your research a really good idea of how you got from start to finish. And then again, that elaboration and explanation document, it's going to give you a much greater understanding, explanation, provide some illustrations or examples of how to interpret and use the checklist. So across all of the checklists we'll talk about today, there is a great support for using this in addition to the checklist. You really shouldn't be using one without the other. And then here at the bottom, you can see the link to the consort's webpage. So here's an example of the 2010 checklist. Again, because there's the 25 items, this is just the first page, but you can see that it goes and it attacks the paper section by section. And so each one of these items is corresponding with where you should be reporting these items, and gives you an idea of how to standardize and report more transparently. On this right-hand side, you'll see that you've got the page number. So again, as you're going through, you're able to give the researcher, the editor, whoever's reading and consuming your research, a really good idea of where to find this information so they don't have to hunt around. Here's the classic flow diagram. So again, it gives you the different phases from enrollment all the way down to analysis, and it prompts you as the researcher to report why participants might not be included in the next stage. So were they allocated but dropped out? Were they removed from analysis, and why was that reason? So again, prompting you to provide the most transparent information that you can. The next checklist we'll talk about is strengthening the reporting of observational studies in epidemiology, or the Strobe Statement. So very similar to the consort, it was developed to address incomplete and inadequate reporting in observational studies. There's many different observational study designs. However, the Strobe Statement was formulated or developed focusing on 3 of the main analytical designs. So the cohort, case control, and cross-sectional studies. First developed in the early 2000s and then published in 2007. There has not been a subsequent revision since then. However, there are several extensions of the Strobe Statement that are available on the Equator Network and then also through the Strobe website itself. So very similar to the consort, checklist has 22 items. Of these, 18 are common to all observational study designs. And then there's 4 items that are specific or need to be a little bit more nuanced depending on whether you have a cohort, a case control, or cross-sectional study. Also has an explanation and elaboration document. So again, very important to expand upon and give the rationale for why these particular checklist items are being included. So here's the example. This is just, again, the first page. But note here for item number 6, you can see that there's a slight delineation or additional ways for the researcher to interpret and answer that question based on whether they have a cohort, case control, or cross-sectional study design. All right, and the last checklist that we'll talk about today, preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, or the Prism Statement. Like the consort for primary level evidence, this is probably the most well-recognized and broadly endorsed checklist for research syntheses, so systematic reviews and meta-analyses. It's considered to be an evidence-based minimum set of items that should be included in all research syntheses. First developed in 1999, but it went by a different name, the Quorum Statement, It was renamed and revised in 2009, and then again in 2020 most recently. There are several extensions available. Most of these extensions are based on the 2009 statement, so stay tuned for additional updates based on the 2020 revisions. It has a checklist, a flow diagram, and the explanation and elaboration document. The checklist items, 27 in total. And again, just like the consort, it goes section by section, identifying where certain elements should be reported to enhance that standardization across meta-analyses and systematic reviews. Flow diagram, very similar to the consort, but this time you're not so much keeping track of participants, but it's the records identified, the screens or the titles that you'll be screening, and then ultimately the sample of included articles. The Prisma explanation elaboration document, again, provides further explanation, examples of why these things are important, how to interpret it, and it provides some nice examples for you as well. Here's the checklist item. So this is, again, just the first page, but set up very similar to consort. You've got the section and topic, checklist item, and then again, a nice place to report where that item is located. This is a great tool for you as a researcher to use, but then as anybody who's consuming this information, it's also very handy to have when you're going through the article. This is the 2020 flow diagram. So for those of you who are familiar with this, it does differ from the previous 2009 flow diagram in a couple of key ways. So first, there are two different Prisma templates depending on what type of review you've done. So in this example, this is for a new systematic review. However, they do have other templates available if this is an update to an existing review. The second item where it differs is depending on the sources that you've used to identify these potential records. So with this one, it's databases, registers, and other sources. And then you can also have it for just databases, so not including the registers, but then also accounting for those other methods. The other point I wanted to bring your attention to is that this Prisma diagram, flow diagram, also sort of pays homage to the fact that this is an evolving science. There's other tools and resources we're using as researchers. And so this is the first Prisma flow diagram that accounts for automation tools. So again, if you are using some type of computer software or automation tool, Prisma suggests that you be clear about how many records were screened or excluded based on actual human screening versus those used with automation tools. So the Equator Network, as Peter mentioned, is a great resource for all things related to enhancing the quality and transparency of health research. So think of this as a nice central repository where you can identify over 250 different reporting guidelines. So that might sound a little bit overwhelming if you're sort of new to this, but the Equator Network does have some tools and some decision tree making to help you sort of identify which reporting guideline or which checklist might be most applicable to yours if one of the most popular ones that we talked about today does not apply. Excellent resource for researchers, authors, editors, consumers alike, not just for their library so that the access to all these different checklists and extensions, but also because they provide little toolkits and other courses and educational events. So these toolkits you can access here. If you go to their main webpage, it gives information and guidance on writing research, on the peer review process, on how to develop a checklist if you're interested. So a whole lot more than just this sort of central repository, but that's also, very helpful. Here's the reporting guideline decision tree that I had mentioned. So again, if you're new to this and you know for sure that you're studying an area that doesn't exactly fall into one of the checklists we might have talked about today, the Equator Network does provide this decision tree. So you would start up here in the corner, and the first question is identifying your research subjects. So are they humans, animals? And then you just would follow these series of questions until you arrive at a checklist. So hopefully you arrive at one of these more popular checklists, but you might in fact arrive at one of these answers. So none of the most popular checklists might apply. That does not mean that there's not a checklist out for you. You just have to do a little bit more digging. So in summary, I want you all to think about these checklists as a minimum set of evidence-based recommendations for reporting different types of studies. These are not synonymous with instruments that are designed to evaluate the conduct or the methodological quality. There are a whole host of different instruments for that purpose. Okay, but these are really important, as Peter mentioned, not only in enhancing the quality, but also the transparency and replicability of various studies. Having an upfront familiarization with many of these checklists is going to help you as a researcher in planning and then also conducting your research. It's really difficult to go back and try to plan for something that you didn't quite plan for and report it. So you want to be able to do those things up front, have a good rigorous study that you can adequately report at the end. As Peter mentioned, one of the main benefits is that it also provides authors with a standardized approach to reporting their findings. That makes it very easy for people to come through and synthesize and digest your literature. So doing this is a great benefit to everybody who's consuming your literature and your research and who wants to maybe use it in one of these larger guidelines and recommendation documents. And in the end, what we all want is to facilitate more complete and transparent reporting, especially of some of these really key pieces of information related to the study. This, in turn, is going to aid with enhanced critical appraisal, interpretation, and use of the literature that we're producing. And just in the couple of minutes I have left, I want to just show you something briefly through the consort page. Again, we won't have the depth and breadth today to get into all the ways that you can use these checklists and really understand how to use them. But for the consort especially, they provide some resources on their websites, which are very helpful. And if you go to their page, they've got their examples here at the top. And so this is just for the consort 2010 statement, but they give an example of a study, and you can scroll through it and look at the various checklist items, and they're highlighted in the different colors you can see here. Trial design, and if you forget about one of the checklist items or you want another more detailed explanation, you can come over here to the side and you can click on explanation example, and this is part of that explanation and elaboration document. It will go into more detail, it will pull it straight from the paper, allow you to read that side by side so that you can enhance your ability to sort of understand and interpret what about this particular study makes it a good example with this checklist item. The other thing I'll just show you since we're on here is the page of extensions. So these are the extensions for consort that are endorsed by the group. And so particularly in exercise science and exercise physiology, what's kind of difficult is with the consort statement for parallel groups. Blinding is really difficult when you're doing an exercise study. And so one of the more recent extensions is this non-pharmacological treatment interventions. So like exercise, like other behavioral interventions, which better address some of the nuances related to the methodology that we would be using when you can't effectively, quote unquote, blind your subjects to the interventions that they're in. You can also see that there's different designs. So within person trial designs, multiple arm, N of 1, so on and so forth. So, do take some time to check this out. Know that they're always developing and evolving. This is not a static process, but it's a good one to get involved with and get familiar with now because there are many applications for it. And Peter and John will definitely talk to you more about this.
Great, thank you, Hayley. Okay, so now I'm just going to move in just with a brief discussion of some of the implications of what Hayley's described for enhancing the quality of research in sport and exercise science. So a question is, when to use a research checklist? And although these are developed for you at the time of when you're going to submit your paper for publication to be sure that you've checked off all the boxes and you have everything in the right place, as Hayley mentioned, they should really be used at the design phase. Now, I learned this the hard way. When I first did my first randomized trial, I wasn't really aware of these checklists, and we designed the study, we conducted the trial, and when I had to submit the study, we were faced with the consort diagram, the consort checklist, and at the time, we had not collected everything that we had needed to properly complete that diagram. So by actually using this at the design phase, for example, when you're writing a grant or when you're actually writing your protocol, this really saves a lot of headaches. And I think that is kind of the best advice I can give today. And what it does is it ensures that all the design elements are in place at baseline, before you've started the study. It also ensures that all the data you need for all of the different required elements are going to be captured. For example, the screening numbers, the inclusion/exclusion criteria, adverse events, the reasons for the dropouts, and the number of dropouts across the different arms. And all of this is extremely important. And they say hindsight is 20/20, and you can't really redesign your study at the postmortem. 100% of the time that fails. So looking here, I just want to give you an example of a couple things here from a recent trial we completed. It was called the Propel trial, and it actually was a cluster randomized design. And as Hayley mentioned, the consort checklist has extensions, and one of the extensions is for cluster randomization. So we couldn't use just a regular consort diagram. We had to use the cluster randomized consort diagram, and it calls for different things. So you need to be aware of these ahead of time. So the first thing is you randomize clinics. You're not randomizing patients. So you see that we have two arms going down each side where we randomize clinics to either intervention or usual care. And we need to, that first red box at the top shows we have to keep track of the patients screened in each arm. And this was a downfall of one of my earlier studies, that we didn't do that. So not only do you have to keep track of who is in your trial, you need to know who is not in your trial. So we definitely need to look at your screening rates, and then here present data based on the clinics, again, rather than the patients. And that second red box, another very important thing that we see all the time from submissions of papers to our journals, is that people haven't kept track of the reasons why the patients were ineligible. It's not enough just to say that they didn't meet the inclusion criteria or the exclusion criteria. We need to know why. And so you can be very detailed or not as detailed, but you definitely need to keep track in some way when people, sign up for your trial, why they were not eligible to participate. And so you can just see in our trial all the different reasons we had, and we clumped them together in various ways that made sense to us. And then finally at the bottom, you hit the patients enrolled and median number of patients per clinic. So this was presented in our methods paper, which we published, after everyone was enrolled in the trial and after the intervention was rolling along. And so that's just another piece of advice that I could give you, that, a lot of people, when they're designing a large trial, for example, they'll try to publish that protocol paper or that methods paper too early. And I've seen this in 3 or 4 different cases in the last couple of years, where they said they were doing something, but then actually before all the patients were enrolled, they actually had to change their methods. So now you have a methods paper published that isn't accurate. It doesn't really reflect what you did. So another piece of advice then is to really wait until everyone is enrolled in your trial and the intervention is well on its way, where you're not going to change your methods before publishing that methods paper. I know people get, they develop the protocol and they submit it to the IRB and they really want to publish that paper. But try to hold off until you're a ways down the road. There's no reason to publish it 3 years ahead of when you're going to publish your outcome data. Okay, on the next slide is from our outcomes paper now. It's just a little snippet because once you've enrolled everyone, they're in the trial, you're going to have to show the number of patients. In this trial, it was weight loss. So you see the number of patients measured at 6 months, 12 months, 18, and 24. And here we need to document the reasons for the dropouts. So in other words, here, like in the one arm, we lost 90 patients, and the other one we lost 43 that didn't have their final weights measured at 24 months. And we need to document the reasons why they didn't have their weight measured. They could have missed their final visit, they could have withdrawn from the study, or in our case, we actually censored their data when they had a major event. For example, if they died or had a major coronary event or became pregnant. So we had pre-specified all of this up front, but you need to track this and you need to measure it and report it. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to also touch on not only the importance of really referring to these checklists, prior to undertaking your study, but on the back end. And this is really important as I've come to realize. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses where we summarize large bodies of evidence, these inform clinical practice guidelines and they inform public health guidelines. So for example, the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee conducted many systematic reviews of the literature to come up with our new physical activity guidelines. And to be able to include a given study in those meta-analyses or in those systematic reviews, they have to meet certain quality metrics. And Hayley made a statement that these research checklists are not quality checklists. And that's true. We have different checklists for quality when we undertake systematic reviews. However, a key factor in increasing the quality of your study is adhering to these reporting guidelines. And what I mean by that is, if you adhere to the reporting guidelines when you design your study and you report it in the literature, there's a much higher probability that you will have a high quality study and that it will be included in these evidence base. And unfortunately, the reason I say this is from the physical activity guidelines perspective, there are a lot of excellent studies out there, but because they were poorly reported, they didn't make it into the evidence base. So the researchers have taken the time to get a grant, to conduct a study, and to report the results, but because of the poor reporting, their data could not go into the guidelines. It's unfortunate, but that's what happens. And that at that point, it really drove it home to me that in order to really enhance our evidence base, we have to go back to the original studies and not only enhance the quality of the science, which was excellent, we had to enhance the quality of the reporting. So you may have done things in your trial that made it a high quality trial, but if you did not report it in the right way, we didn't know about it. The reader doesn't know. So like I say, there's a lot of high quality science going on, but we also need high quality reporting. And it's unfortunate when that happens, when you look at the reference list of a nice systematic review and you find your study's not there. Why is my study not there? Well, you go back to the quality metrics and you see that it was deemed to be low quality. And this happens. So Hayley mentioned some considerations when using checklists in exercise science, and I'm glad she pointed out the issue of blinding and that the extension be to behavioral interventions, because blinding is extremely important. You need to describe blinding as part of the consort checklist, but it's sometimes impossible, right? In a physical activity intervention, people know whether they're doing activity or they know they're doing strength versus aerobic. It's hard to blind the patients. But we do need to know measures of adherence. And this is something that's, it's not tracked as well in other fields of medicine, but it's something we do very well in exercise science, is we understand adherence and we know how to report it. And so we need to continue to do that and report that in our papers. And one of the biggest issues we found is adverse events. That in our, looking at across all the trials, that was the major reason for downgrading of quality, because people didn't report the adverse events that had occurred in their trial. That was probably number one, actually. So it's important that you track your adverse events in your trials and you report them. You report the number of adverse events by arm. And this was also problematic in the physical activity guidelines because you want to balance the benefits and the harms of activity. And when we did a review of adverse events, we found that they were very rarely reported in exercise trials. However, if you go to the large cardiovascular trials, on hypertension and the diabetes trials, they always report their adverse events by arm and test for differences by arm. And we certainly need to do that more in exercise science. It'll really give us a boost. So with that, thank you for your attention and listening to me ramble on here. But I'm now going to turn it over to John, and he can talk about the translational journal.
Thank you, Peter. So thank you all for being here today. I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of an editor's perspective and how we think about checklists and try to implement this. And I'm the editor-in-chief of the Translational Journal of the American College of Sports Medicine. We're really focused on bridging that gap from sort of basic to clinical research to practice in sports medicine, exercise science. And I have been the editor for about a year and a half. And when I first came on board, the initial focus was relatively narrow on control trials with the expectation that people would follow consort guidelines. When you have that as a focus and you have that narrow focus as a journal, it's relatively easy to guide authors in terms of what to report and what to make happen. But we've moved to a much broader consideration of translational research and far greater complexity with regards to this. Hayley referred to this a little bit, but let's go to the next slide and I'll show you sort of the evolution that has taken place. So again, when I first came on board, we were primarily publishing observational studies and control trials, relatively straightforward checklists to be able to guide authors to. But then we expanded that focus to some of the foundational research. So we now publish commentaries, but then we also do feasibility and pilot studies and protocol reports that individuals have, which then bring into one of the consort extensions that Hayley talked about, as well as the SPIRIT reporting checklist. Then we moved on to add the sort of subsequent research that comes, questions of implementation science, scoping reviews that we would work with, as well as policy briefs. And so if you now look at the full range on the next slide of the translational journal, we are really trying to publish work from conception to the impact on policy and that full translational process. And that is incredibly complex in terms of the types of studies that we publish and that we review, and require us to think about this in a really interesting way and how we guide people. And so this has been a lot of the initial work that we did was focused on instruction for authors and how to make this go. And because this first idea was, how do we guide authors through this complexity? And so this is a screenshot that is taken from our guide for authors. And I want to credit, actually, Emily Dunlap is my editorial assistant, one of our doctoral students in physiology. And when Hayley was talking about the different extensions, I hadn't seen the extension on the non-pharma to be able to help with blinding. And Emily, I just had a discussion about this yesterday. So I texted her and said, did you know that consort had this? She wrote back that, yes, she's actually on the webinar. So that is a pretty good indication of why we've hired her into this role. But this is a lot of work that Emily did in terms of creating the instruction for authors and then how we guide them through this complexity. So we have a long narrative that has hot links to each one of these checklists with it. But then we also put together this table for each of the type of studies that we publish, the guidelines that we have in terms of length for those studies, and then where to find the checklist to be able to ensure that you are providing the appropriate information. And so this, I think, helps us give authors the information that they need, access to this so that they can find it. But that's really only part of the equation. Not only do we need to give them that information, but we need to think about creating a process to ensure reporting, because the fact of the matter is not everybody reads the instruction for authors. They don't read it as detailed as they should, and they don't always report that. We have more of an historical approach to writing manuscripts and require those things that our advisor required us to have whenever we got our Ph.D.s. And so it's a very, we lack that consistency, hence the need for this discussion today. And so one of the questions we had within creating this process was who completes the reviews and who categorizes the necessary edits. This should not be an area of focus for reviewers. right? It's hard enough to find reviewers without putting this burden on them, because their focus should be on the quality of the research and how well the writing reflects that quality and the limits and the strengths of that research. It should not be focused on whether or not they're reporting appropriate information. Each of our journals are supported by editorial staff that are managing editors for this to help us work through the process and track articles, and they're often the first port of contact that individuals have. But a lot of the questions that we have are reasonably complicated in nature, and you need a strong level of training to be able to pick up on where we're missing aspects of this and necessary reporting to be able to recognize that. And so that is putting, I think, too large a burden on those individuals to make that happen. And so what we've hit upon is to use Emily, at least at this point, is what we're piloting right now as an editorial assistant. And we are right in the process of trying to create this process and move this forward and how it's going to work. And we're still iterating that process. But in any event, what we're doing right now is that Emily will be able to provide that because she has research training. She's in a Ph.D. program. She can skim articles to be able to see what information is there and what information is not there. But this leads to a second question of the process to communicate to authors and what is really an extension of this challenge, which is, when do you require edits to ensure reporting compliance? So one possibility is that we can require a full revision prior to review. So individuals submit, we look for the required information. If you don't have that information, we send it back to you, ask you to complete that information and send it back. Well, that is a policy that is not likely to increase submissions. And there are certain journals that are fine with that and don't have that issue. But when you're not the flagship journal of the organization, that can become problematic. And if you look at your competitors in other journals, so prevention medicine, I'm pretty sure I could actually handwrite an article and scan it in as a PDF and they would review it. They review any format, any structure that you have with the philosophy that they'll clean it all up on the back end if it gets accepted. And so this level of review prior to that, I don't think is really viable for most journals in how to go about their business. And so do we instead make that a report following acceptance so that once it's been accepted, then we give them this report and then they have to fix all of it to go there? Or do we make this part of the primary review process? And what we've hit on at this point is that we're going to pilot right now making it part of the primary review process. And so the structure that we're going to use now is that Emily will do this review, identify the areas that are missing, and then that will be one of the reviews, one of 3 reviews that goes out. When we get the other 2 reviews in, the associate editor or myself, whoever's the action editor, will then send those reviews to communicate to the author, and addended to that will be this checklist that we use. It is not a specific checklist that is differentiated with each one of the different aspects of that. It's a broader checklist that includes more information than any of the individual any of the individual articles might need, but it gives us a frame of reference to ensure that we get the majority of information that we need. So we're going to try that right now and see how that works, so that authors would then, if they get a revise and resubmit, in the response to that revision, they would adjust the information to provide all of that. Because if they can't provide that information, then that does become something that we need to think about in that next phase of review on whether or not the article will be accepted. So our lessons learned, it is not enough for us to support uniform reporting checklist and say, yeah, that's a great idea, and put in instructions to authors. That is insufficient to be able to make that happen. That's critical, and that is a required aspect of this, but our responsibilities are a little bit broader than that. The real change requires structures of practice to ensure compliance. And if we're going to be committed to having transparent work, if we're going to be committed to positioning our authors as well as possible, that their work can be included in subsequent scoping reviews, and that their work is going to have the greatest impact possible. And if we're committed to kind of re-educating the field, and I think that's part of our job as reviewers, whatever the journal is, I think that's part of our job when you're part of the journal for an organization to ensure that the membership is well trained and that they evolve as the standards evolve. And so if we don't hold that standard, then I think this really falls apart. And so if we're going to be committed to that, then we need to check it, and we need to have these processes and do the work necessary to be able to make that go and to be able to move that forward. But again, it is challenging giving an academic world that values autonomy. Faculty, people don't become researchers to be told what to do. People become researchers because they want to run their own ship. You know, this isn't a problem if you're publishing in science. This isn't a problem if you're publishing in New England Journal of Medicine. People will do what they need to do to publish there. It is harder for most journals to be able to do that because, you know, authors will naturally seek, as a behavioral researcher myself, people seek those things with the least barriers. And so what we're trying to balance is, how do we hold a line? How do we advance the field in terms of the quality of the research, while at the same time making it tolerable to authors so that they continue to publish and they value the experience that they've had with the translational journal. And so it's an ongoing process. As you check our instructions for authors, you'll see updates as we go forward. And as we check this process, we're going to iterate through, and we'll try this out. We're having a meeting of the associate editors next week to talk about this process. And if that works, we'll carry this out for a couple of months and then evaluate, and then decide if we need to do this in a different way. So thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. That was a really great, informative, and helpful series of presentations, so we really appreciate your time. I want to remind folks to put their questions, type your questions into the area on GoToWebinar. We aren't using the raise your hand function for this webinar. Go ahead and type your questions in, and we're going to get started with some questions. So here's one that we'll start with. Can you provide some additional examples of items on some of these checklists that might be confusing for authors?
That's a good question. You got us stumped here. Maybe John has an answer.
My initial response to that is, it's less about confusion, because if the guidelines, when they apply to the research design that you're doing, I think they generally make sense. And when you look at those checklists, I think it makes sense for what you're doing. I think the difficulty is when you are using a checklist that doesn't apply to your research because you're not aware of the different versions of this. And this is, you know, sort of the tension in this, right? We keep getting extensions and these flow charts of which ones to select, which makes it complicated. But the reason for that is, as we talked about with blinding, as the perfect example of this, is it's very difficult in our research to blind. And if anybody's used the Downs and Black checklist for study quality, you're faced with the exact same issue. Those are written for a very specific type of clinical research that really doesn't apply to a lot of the work that we end up publishing. And so you're always having to modify that, and that creates a lot of the confusion. So I think the confusion is on the end of picking the appropriate checklist more than it is, once you get the right checklist, being able to make that work.
I would just second that. I think that's a great answer. And, you know, as these consort extensions and various extensions come out, I think that will get less and less confusing. But again, there is some difficulty in understanding exactly how you want to go through. Yeah, I'm just going to not say that word, but going through those checklists and identifying how much information is enough in terms of what you're looking for within your respective field. So, you know, you have to give it some thought. You have to read it within context. Search around to see if you can find some of those extensions, because it will make a lot more sense than having to sort of pave the way yourself.
Great, thank you. This participant is wondering about earlier exposure to the checklist. So for example, if you're exposed to these checklists and get familiar with them, even as an undergraduate student, do you think there's value in that? Will it help folks as they move along in their careers?
No, I agree. I think this should be an integral part of research methods courses. And Hayley is right in the thick of it there. Maybe she might be able to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that more exposure to it, I think we're all guilty at some point as either an undergrad or maybe going through our master's, not really understanding the nuances and sort of all the levels and the planning and the protocol that goes into some of these studies. And so the more you can familiarize yourself with some of those questions and those processes, I think the better positioned you'll be to ask really good questions. Think about what's going into the study protocol. It's not just about collecting the fun data in the lab. There's a lot of planning that goes into it ahead of time. So if you can start thinking about those things early on, I think you'll be in a better position to get as much as you can from those experiences in your latter years.
I'm also a department chair, and as a department chair, I will tell you that training faculty is rarely an effective practice. You are much more effective at training graduate students and undergraduates who then have that influence on their labs through their faculty, because all the graduate students know what's going on and how to write it, and then they start writing that way, and then the faculty are sort of pulled along. With IRB changes, with whatever policy changes we work out, it's always more effective to train the graduate students first.
Great, thank you. So for those who haven't worked with these checklists as much or may not be really clear on the difference between checklists for reporting versus for study quality, do these checklists ask you to report items like gender, race, age, things that could be moderators, or are the questions pretty specific to research design?
That's a really good point to bring up. So I think Peter made this point, and I should have put an asterisk when I said, quality reporting and sort of the methodological quality. It's really rare to find a really methodologically rigorous study with very high quality in terms of like the methods used if they're not reported very well. Those kinds of situations I don't think happen all the time. They certainly do. And so this is where some of that vagueness comes into with some of the questions. It will say something to the extent, was the population detailed with enough or given or provided enough description about the sample? And so you, I think, have to decide when you're thinking about this in terms of what's important for your particular niche. What are the things that have to be reported? You would assume it'd be age, race, gender, ethnicity, all these things. But, I don't think, in my experience, those checklists have given enough detail in some of those. So that might be a little bit area specific.
And just to follow up on the quality checklist versus reporting, they, as Hayley mentioned, they do interact quite extensively. So, for example, one of the quality questions, I can't remember exactly what quality checklist it is, but it asks you to, were the follow-up rates balanced between the two groups, or the dropout rates, for example? Well, when you designed your study and you used the consort diagram, you were able to report the follow-up rates in both groups separately, then the reviewer can actually address that question. But if you had not bothered to do that, if you didn't follow the consort and you didn't provide dropout rates separately by group, then they would downgrade you on that. So again, they do interact in that way. So, I think it's important to kind of keep both in mind as you're designing studies.
Yeah, that's a great point, Peter. So we have a couple of questions here that are specific to the translational journal. One is, do you automatically reject research manuscripts that don't meet the checklist requirements as medical journals typically do?
We do not. So again, the process that we're starting now is we will do an initial review, and the assumption that we're making is that people will be able to report those factors upon review and that they just failed to include all the information. And so we begin with that as an assumption, and then that is going to become part of the primary review that happens, and we'll ask for that additional reporting information. If they are not able to report that information, then we have to weigh how important that lack of information is to judging the quality of the research and whether or not it should be published. My view is by including that checklist as a part of the primary review, it will, and again, not the reviewers, but we will addend that from our editorial assistant. We're doing a lot to emphasize the importance of this reporting and making sure that that information is there and helping to sort of shift the culture of researchers in making that happen. And then, so the answer to that question is no, unless it creates a real problem during review. But otherwise, my guess is we will continue to accept high quality articles that might be missing some information and just use this as part of that sort of regulatory process to help bring people along.
Great. Another question is complying with clinicaltrials.gov requirements sufficient for your journal to go forward with the manuscript submission?
So again, it's sufficient for manuscript submission and for us to get through the review process, but there may be aspects that are missing from that that you would need to have as a part of the checklist, and we'll just do that part of review and then you can report it later on. And again, if you don't, like in Peter's situation with his first large trial where he didn't collect all the information he would normally have, as a part of his response to review, he would have to say, we don't have that information. We didn't collect it. And then we have to decide how big an issue that is in terms of moving that forward.
Great, thank you. Because these checklists make it pretty easy, why do you think they haven't been widely adopted?
Well, again, I think John hit on it. You know, when we all came through our PhD programs, we did it the way that our mentors did it and the way we were told to do it. And so in my early days as a professor, I wasn't aware of them at all. I just didn't know about them. And we just kept doing things the way we always did. But hopefully webinars like we're doing today and through the efforts of the journals, you know, that more people will become aware of them. And by including them in graduate research courses, it should change the culture, I think.
One of the things that I'm wondering about is, just as we were having this webinar, is to suggest including the appropriate checklist as a part of the dissertation proposal or a master's thesis proposal, and that you would have to be able to check off all of this information and where it's available and how you were going to collect the data if you didn't have it at this point. And so that to me seems like one of the things that we can do to start to change this from a cultural perspective, because again, you have to have these systems in place that require it, and that I think would be would really train students well to make sure it was there and hold faculty accountable for it.
Mm-hmm.
So just to clarify, so if people are looking for various types of questions, maybe for a case report or maybe some type of quality improvement project, that would be Equator. They would go to Equator and look. Is that correct?
I think Equator is a great place to start if you're not sure, if it's not one of the checklists that you often hear about or one of the ones that's commonly endorsed, or if the journal itself or wherever you're submitting doesn't have any requirements. You should go to Equator. You can search by the type of study design. It will give you a whole host of them as well. And then usually within the Equator library, if you do select a checklist, it will also provide all of the extensions that exist so far. So if there have been modifications for a particular research area or niche, then those will be listed there as well.
Is the sense that most journals nowadays, at least the medical journals, are requiring these checklists, or is this kind of unique to ACSM, for example?
No, I get a sense that, from my perspective, a lot of them are not. A lot of the real high-end ones are, for sure. But a lot of them are struggling with the same issues we're struggling with at ACSM in terms of how to implement this with the personnel at the journals and the issues that John raised. But I do find now that it's almost all journals are asking that your trials be registered, you know, at clinicaltrials.gov or whatever it may be. That has certainly come around, and now almost every journal I think requires that, which was not the case 10 years ago. And so I think we'll see the same thing with these checklists, that right now there's, you know, I wouldn't even hazard a guess at how many as a percentage require them. But most, though, do suggest them or recommend them in their guide to authors.
Great.
I would say just to follow up with that, in terms of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, I do feel like many journals more comprehensively are asking authors to fill those things out when they submit them, maybe more so than some of the primary level or experimental studies, but usually they'll ask you questions that are embedded in that. So I think if you can just hit it head on, and even if they don't ask for it, include that with your submission documents, you're just making everybody's life a little bit easier, and you know that you've covered all of those bases as well.
Yeah, I was talking to Bruce Gladden and at the MSSE, and you know what they were saying was that even though they don't require them or ask for them, many authors are now including them with their submission materials voluntarily. You know, if they do a systematic review, they include the Prisma report, etc. So authors are proactively including these with their review materials already. So that's a good sign.
All right. Thank you guys again. We are running out of time, so we want to thank our presenters for a great talk, lots of really good, helpful information. I know some of you may not have had time to write down some of the different websites that were discussed, so we want to make everyone aware that we have recorded this webinar, and we will be putting it on the acsm.org site so that you can refer back to it, and you can start learning more about checklists and diving into Equator. We also want to remind you that the annual meeting is virtual this year, so that's coming. That will be June 1 through 5, and registration is open. We have early bird registration until May 1st, so we want to encourage everyone to join us at the annual meeting this year. With that, we'll say thanks again to our presenters. Thank you for all of you who have participated today and for the great questions. And with that, we'll end the webinar and say goodbye. Thanks again.
Thank you all.